Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper in 1963 that destroyed 2,000 years of philosophy, not by offering a new theory, not by constructing an elaborate argument, not by marshalling evidence or appealing to grand principles, but simply by describing two cases, two simple scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. And these cases were so straightforward, so devastating, so impossible to dismiss, that they shattered the definition of knowledge that had stood since Plato, the definition that said knowledge was justified true belief. And in the decades since philosophers have tried to repair the damage, have proposed dozens of modifications and additions and qualifications, have added fourth conditions and fifth conditions, have distinguished types of justification and types of truth and types of belief, and none of it has worked. None of it has produced a definition that captures all and only cases of knowledge, that avoids counterexamples, that does what definitions are supposed to do. And the question is whether this failure reveals something about knowledge itself, whether knowledge resists definition not because philosophers have not been clever enough, but because definition is the wrong tool, because knowledge is not the kind of thing that can be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, because the project of analysing knowledge was misconceived from the start. The cases themselves are almost too simple. In one, a person looks at a clock that has stopped but happens to look at the moment when the stop time matches the actual time. They form a justified true belief about what time it is. The belief is true. The justification seems perfectly adequate. They looked at a clock and clocks are generally reliable. But this is not knowledge. It is luck. It is coincidence. It is the kind of situation where we want to say the person got it right but did not know. And in the other case, a person believes their colleague owns a Ford because they have seen them driving a Ford for years. They infer from this that someone in the office owns a Ford, and it turns out someone in the office does own a Ford, but it is not the colleague. It is someone else entirely. And again, there is justified true belief, but no knowledge. The justification was good. The belief was true. But the connection between justification and truth went through the wrong path, depended on a falsehood succeeded by accident rather than by the proper relation between evidence and reality. These cases reveal something philosophers had not noticed before, that justification and truth can come apart in subtle ways, that a belief can be justified and true without the justification being what makes it true, without the truth being because of the justification. And this gap, this disconnect, this possibility of luck intervening between justification and truth is what makes justified true belief insufficient for knowledge. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes obvious that knowledge requires not just justification and truth, but the right connection between them. Requires that the truth be non-accidental, be because of rather than merely accompanied by the justification. And this seems like it should be easy to fix, should be easy to add to the definition. Just require that the belief be justified and true, and not Gettiered, not undermined by luck, not true by accident, and problem solved. But this is where the real trouble begins. Because no one can say what it means for a belief to be non-accidentally true. No one can define luck in a way that is not circular, not question-begging, not itself dependent on an intuitive grasp of what knowledge is. The natural move is to say that knowledge requires a reliable connection between belief and truth, that the method that produced the belief must be one that generally produces true beliefs. And this is reliabilism, the view that knowledge is reliably produced true belief. And this avoids Gettier cases because in Gettier cases, the belief is not reliably produced, the stopped clock is not a reliable method. The inference from the colleague's Ford to someone owning a Ford goes through an unreliable intermediate step. And so, reliabilism can say these are not knowledge because they fail the reliability condition. But reliabilism faces its own problems. It faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify the relevant type of belief. Forming process, because any process can be described at many levels of generality. Looking at a clock is a reliable process, but looking at this particular stopped clock is not. And which description is the right one? Which is the type that matters for knowledge? And there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer this, no principle that determines the correct level of generality. And without such a principle, reliabilism cannot be applied, cannot deliver verdicts about particular cases, cannot do the work a theory of knowledge is supposed to do. Goldman tried to solve this with proper function, with the idea that the relevant process is the one that evolution, or learning, or some other natural process designed the cognitive system to perform. And this gives a non-arbitrary way to pick out process types, but it introduces new problems. Problems about what counts as proper function, about whether knowledge requires biological or social or individual design, about whether malfunction always destroys knowledge or only sometimes. And these questions proved as difficult as the original Gettier problem, generated their own literature, their own debates, their own unresolved puzzles. Others tried causal theories, theories that said knowledge requires a causal connection between the fact and the belief, that you can only know that Pi if P causes your belief that P, and this handles some Gettier cases. The stopped clock case involves no causal connection between the actual time and the belief about the time. But causal theories face problems with knowledge of abstract objects, with mathematical knowledge, with knowledge of the future, with any case where the thing known does not seem capable of causing beliefs, and the theory had to be abandoned or modified into something so hedged with qualifications that it lost its initial appeal, its initial promise of solving Gettier with a simple, elegant condition. Nozick proposed tracking, the idea that knowledge requires that the belief track the truth, that if P were false, the person would not believe P, and if P were true in nearby circumstances, the person would believe P, and this captures something important, captures the idea that knowledge involves a kind of sensitivity to truth, a responsiveness that is missing in Gettier cases. But tracking faces problems too. Problems with closure, the principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you can know Q by inference. Because tracking does not preserve closure. You can track one truth without tracking what it entails. And this means Nozick's theory implies you can know you have hands without knowing you are not a brain in a vat. And this seems wrong, seems like a bullet too large to bite. And most philosophers rejected tracking for this reason, even while acknowledging it captured something about knowledge that justified true belief missed. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a fourth condition, someone finds a counterexample, the condition is modified, new counterexamples appear, the modifications multiply, the theory becomes baroque, loses its explanatory power, and eventually is abandoned in favour of a new approach that promises to avoid the problems of its predecessors. And this new approach inevitably faces its own counterexamples, its own difficulties, its own descent into complexity and qualification. And after 60 years of this, the epistemological community is no closer to a widely accepted definition of knowledge than it was when Gettier published his paper, and some have begun to suspect that this is not a temporary problem, not a sign that philosophers have not been clever enough, but a permanent feature of the concept of knowledge itself, a sign that knowledge resists analysis, that it cannot be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, that the classical project of defining knowledge is not incomplete, but impossible. Williamson argued exactly this. He claimed that knowledge is primitive, that it cannot be analysed into more basic components, that it is a mental state in its own right, rather than a compound of belief and justification and truth. And this means the Gettier problem is not a problem to be solved, but a symptom of trying to do something that cannot be done, like trying to define yellow in terms of non-colour concepts, like trying to analyse consciousness into purely physical terms. And if Williamson is right, then all the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis, all the fourth conditions and modifications and qualifications were doomed from the start. We're trying to define the undefinable, to analyse the primitive, and the right response is not to keep trying but to give up, to accept that knowledge is basic, that epistemology can still study its properties and relations without being able to define it, that not everything can be reduced to simpler components. But this seems like defeat, seems like giving up on philosophy's traditional task, and many resist it, continue to search for a definition, continue to propose new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding the connection between belief and truth that knowledge requires. And this persistence is partly admirable, partly stubborn refusal to accept limits, and partly a failure to recognise when a project has failed, when the evidence is overwhelming that the goal is unreachable, that the concept being analysed is not structured the way analysis assumes, and the question is which interpretation is correct, whether continued work on the analysis of knowledge is noble persistence or futile stubbornness, whether the next theory might finally succeed or whether success is impossible. The externalism-internalism debate intersects with all of this, because Gettier cases reveal a tension between what the believer has access to and what makes belief knowledge. The person with justified true belief in a Gettier case cannot tell from the inside that they lack knowledge, cannot distinguish their situation from genuine knowledge by introspection or reflection. And this suggests that knowledge depends on external factors, on how the belief was actually formed, on whether the process was reliable, on whether the connection to truth was proper, and these are not things the believer necessarily has access to, not things that show up in consciousness, not things that can be known by reflection alone. And this means externalism is true. Knowledge is partly constituted by factors external to the mind, by relations to the environment that the knower may not be aware of. And this is deeply counterintuitive, deeply at odds with the Cartesian picture, where knowledge is transparent to the knower, where what one knows is fully accessible to reflection, where the mental is self-intimating and clear. But Gettier forces this conclusion, forces the recognition that knowledge can depend on facts. The knower does not, and perhaps cannot know, that there can be twins who are internally identical but differ in knowledge because they differ in environment. And this seems to violate something important about the nature of mind, about the privacy of the mental, about the authority each person has over their own beliefs. Yet the alternative seems worse, seems to deny that knowledge requires any external connection to reality at all, seems to make knowledge purely a matter of internal coherence or justification, and this would allow the brain in a vat to have knowledge, would make knowledge independent of truth, would sever the connection between mind and world that knowledge seems essentially to involve. The lottery paradox connects to Gettier through the problem of knowledge of conjunction. You know that ticket 1 will not win. You know that ticket 2 will not win. You know this for each ticket individually, because the probability of any ticket winning is negligible, but you cannot know that some ticket will win. Even though you know this must be true, and this seems wrong, seems like knowledge should be closed under conjunction, should allow you to put together things You know into knowledge of their conjunction, but if it does, then you can know both that no particular ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these cannot both be known because they contradict. And this reveals something about the nature of knowledge, that it is not simply high probability, not simply justified belief that is very likely to be true, but something more demanding, something that excludes a certain kind of luck or chance. And this connects to Gettier because Gettier cases are cases where justified true belief holds, but knowledge fails because of luck, because of accident, because the truth was not guaranteed by the justification. And the lottery case suggests that knowledge requires guarantee, requires that the truth not be accidental, but what counts as guarantee? What excludes accident? These questions have no clear answer, no consensus, no definition that everyone accepts. Contextualism tries to solve some of these problems by saying that whether someone knows depends on context, on what alternatives are relevant, on how demanding the standards are in the conversational situation, and in ordinary contexts, knowledge is easy to have, requires only that obvious alternatives be ruled out. But in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are raised, where brain-in-vat possibilities are mentioned, the standards rise and knowledge becomes harder or impossible to have. And this explains why knowledge seems to come and go, why we are happy to say we know things in ordinary life, but hesitate when doing philosophy. But contextualism faces problems too. Problems about whether the standards really vary or whether we are just more careful in philosophical contexts. Problems about how context determines standards. Problems about disagreements between people in different contexts who seem to be making incompatible claims. And like every other approach to knowledge after Gettier, contextualism captures something, but fails to capture everything, solves some problems, but creates others, and the dialectic continues, endlessly, inconclusively. Zagzebski showed that any analysis of knowledge that adds conditions to justified true belief to avoid Gettier will face its own Gettier-style counterexamples, that there is a recipe for generating such cases, and this is a kind of meta-Gettier problem, a problem not just with the original definition, but with the entire project of modifying it. And her argument suggests that the problem is not with particular proposals, but with the form of analysis itself, with the attempt to understand knowledge as justified true belief plus something. And if she's right, then the only options are to abandon analysis entirely, as Williamson suggests, or to abandon the justified true belief framework altogether, to start from scratch with a completely different approach. And some have tried this, have proposed that knowledge is a kind of ability, that it is acquaintance with facts, that it is constituted by the safety or sensitivity of belief, that it is a matter of having conclusive reasons, and each of these departs from the traditional framework. Each tries to rethink knowledge from the ground up, but each also faces objections. Each struggles to handle the full range of cases. Each eventually generates its own literature of problems and refinements and counterexamples. The phenomenon of epistemic luck is at the heart of all this. Gettier cases are cases of epistemic luck, cases where true belief is not the result of epistemic virtue or proper cognitive functioning, but of fortunate coincidence, and knowledge excludes epistemic luck. This much seems clear, but epistemic luck comes in many forms. Veritic luck, where the truth is accidental. Evidential luck, where the evidence is accidentally good. Content luck, where the belief happens to be about something true by coincidence. And maybe knowledge is incompatible with some forms of luck, but not others. Maybe some amount of luck is inevitable in any finite cognitive system operating in an uncertain world. And the question is where to draw the line. Which kinds of luck destroy knowledge and which do not? And there seems to be no principled way to answer this. No theory that gets all the cases right. No definition that excludes exactly the right amount of luck without excluding too much or too little. Sosa's virtue epistemology tries to handle this by saying that knowledge is true, belief that is accurate because adroit, because of the exercise of cognitive ability, and Gettier cases fail because they are accurate, but not because adroit. The belief is true, but not because of skill, and this seems promising, seems to capture what goes wrong in Gettier cases, but it faces questions about what counts as ability, about whether being in a good environment is part of ability or a separate factor, about whether knowledge requires that ability be exercised in the right way, or just that it be exercised. And these questions prove difficult, generate their own debates, and the theory fragments into animal knowledge and reflective knowledge, and different grades of knowledge. And what started as a simple, elegant idea becomes complex and qualified and contested. The situationist challenge from social psychology raises doubts about whether cognitive abilities even exist, whether there are stable traits that manifest across situations, or whether behavior, including cognitive behavior, is mostly determined by situation rather than character. And if situationism is right, then virtue epistemology is based on a false assumption, based on the idea that people have stable cognitive abilities when really they have only situational responses. And this would not just undermine one theory of knowledge, but would call into question the entire picture of knowledge as something stable, something dispositional, something that inheres in persons rather than emerging from person-situation interactions. And while most epistemologists have not taken situationism seriously, have not fully grappled with its implications, it represents a potential crisis, a challenge from outside philosophy that could overturn assumptions epistemology has relied on for centuries. The Gettier problem has become emblematic of philosophy's condition, of its inability to solve problems definitively, to reach consensus, to make progress in the way sciences do, and critics point to 60 years of post-Gettier epistemology as evidence that philosophy is confused, that it asks questions that have no answers, that it pursues definitions that cannot be given, and defenders respond. That philosophy is hard, that concepts like knowledge are genuinely complex, that the lack of consensus is not failure, but the nature of inquiry into fundamental questions. But the defense sounds hollow after decades of effort that have produced no solution, no widely. When probability contradicts intuition, there is a game show, a host, 3 doors, behind one door a car, behind the other 2 goats. The contestant picks a door. The host, who knows what is behind each door, opens a different door, revealing a goat. Then offers the contestant a choice: stay with the original door or switch to the remaining unopened door. And almost everyone's intuition says, it does not matter, says the probability is now 50-50, says switching and staying are equivalent because there are 2 doors left and one has the car. But this intuition is completely wrong. Switching doubles the chance of winning, gives a 2/3 probability instead of 1/3, and this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of Let's Make a Deal. And it has become famous not just as a probability puzzle, but as a demonstration of how badly human intuition performs with probability, how confidently people cling to wrong answers, how even mathematicians and statisticians initially rejected the correct solution. And this raises deep questions about rationality, about whether humans are capable of probabilistic reasoning, about whether intuition can be trusted in any domain, about what it means to be rational if rationality requires calculations that almost no one can perform. The solution requires seeing that the initial choice had a 1/3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2/3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors, and when the host opens one of those doors revealing a goat, that 2/3 probability does not disappear, it transfers entirely to the remaining unopened door, so switching gives a 2/3 chance while staying gives only the original 1/3 chance. And this can be proven mathematically, can be demonstrated through computer simulation, can be explained through careful reasoning about conditional probability, but none of this stops people from insisting the answer must be 50-50, from rejecting the correct solution as absurd, from trusting their intuition over the mathematics. And this is not stupidity, not ignorance, not carelessness. This is the way human minds naturally process probability, the way intuition works when confronted with conditional probabilities and updating in light of new evidence. And the fact that intuition gets it wrong reveals something troubling about human rationality, about the gap between how we think we reason and how we actually reason, about the possibility that many of our confident judgments about probability are as wrong as the intuition that switching does not matter. Bayesian epistemology takes probability as fundamental to rational belief, says that beliefs should be assigned degrees of confidence, that these degrees should obey the probability calculus, that they should update through Bayes' theorem when new evidence arrives. And this seems like the right way to think about belief, seems to capture how science works, how learning happens, how rational agents should respond to evidence. But the Monty Hall problem shows that humans are not natural Bayesians, do not intuitively update probabilities correctly, do not automatically apply Bayes' theorem, do not even recognize when a situation calls for probabilistic reasoning rather than simple counting. And if this is true, then Bayesian epistemology is not a description of how humans actually reason, but a normative standard that almost no one meets, an ideal that is psychologically unrealistic, a requirement for rationality that makes rationality impossible for creatures like us. Kahneman and Tversky spent decades documenting the ways human probability judgments deviate from normative standards. The base rate neglect, where people ignore prior probabilities. The conjunction fallacy, where people judge conjunctions more probable than their components. The availability heuristic, where people estimate probability based on how easily examples come to mind. And these are not occasional errors, but systematic biases. Not mistakes that education eliminates, but deep features of human cognition that persist, even in experts, even in people who understand probability theory, even in situations where people are explicitly trying to reason correctly. And this research suggests that human minds are not built for probability, that our intuitions evolved for different problems, for quick judgments in environments where exact probabilities were unknown and unknowable, where rough heuristics that usually worked were better than precise calculations that took too long. And these heuristics still dominate our thinking, still produce judgments that feel right even when they are mathematically wrong. And the question is whether we should try to override these intuitions, should try to become more Bayesian, should train ourselves to calculate rather than intuit, or whether we should accept that humans are not and cannot be perfectly rational in the Bayesian sense, should build theories of rationality that fit how we actually think, rather than demanding we think in ways that are psychologically impossible. The reference class problem makes this even more difficult, because applying probability requires knowing what reference class to use, what group of similar cases to draw on when estimating probability, and there is often no unique right answer. Many reference classes are possible. They give different probabilities, and there is no mechanical rule for choosing among them. Only judgment, only intuition, only the same kind of thinking that gets Monty Hall wrong. And this means that even if humans could perfectly apply Bayes' theorem, even if we could update probabilities flawlessly, we would still face the problem of choosing which probabilities to start with, which reference class to use, which background assumptions to make. And these choices are not themselves governed by probability theory, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of rational constraint that Bayesianism promises. And this suggests that probabilistic rationality cannot be purely computational, cannot be reduced to algorithms, cannot eliminate the need for judgment that might be right or wrong in ways that transcend calculation. Subjective Bayesianism tries to handle this by saying that prior probabilities are subjective, are personal degrees of confidence that can differ between rational agents. And as long as priors satisfy the probability axioms and updating follows Bayes' theorem, any priors are rationally permissible, and agents with different priors will converge on the same posteriors given enough shared evidence, or so the theorem says, but this convergence can take a very long time, can require more evidence than is ever available. And in the meantime, agents with different priors will reach different conclusions, will make different predictions, will act differently, and there is no rational way to adjudicate between them. No standard that says one set of priors is better than another. No requirement beyond internal consistency, and this seems too permissive, seems to make rationality trivial, seems to allow anything as rational as long as it obeys the probability calculus. And conspiracy theorists obey the probability calculus. They just have different priors. They assign high probability to things most people assign low probability to, and they update on evidence in their own way. And by subjective Bayesian standards, they might be perfectly rational. Just starting from different priors. And this cannot be right. This is not what rationality means. There must be some constraint on priors, some requirement beyond consistency, some standard that distinguishes reasonable from unreasonable starting points. But what that standard is, how to specify it, how to justify it without circularity, these questions have no clear answer. Objective Bayesianism tries to solve this by saying there are objective priors, that some probability assignments are privileged by logic or symmetry or information theory, that the principle of indifference or maximum entropy or some other principle determines what priors rationality requires. But each of these principles faces problems. The principle of indifference leads to paradoxes when applied to continuous quantities or overlapping partitions. Maximum entropy requires choosing a measure, and different measures give different entropies, and none of these principles seems to capture what we pre-theoretically think rationality requires. None of them vindicates our intuitive judgments about which beliefs are reasonable. And this suggests that the project of grounding probability in pure logic or symmetry has failed, that probability is not a priori but depends on empirical facts, on the actual frequencies in the world, on the causal structure of reality. And this leads back to frequentism, to the view that probabilities are objective features of the world, are long-run frequencies or propensities or chances built into the physical processes. But frequentism faces its own problems. The reference class problem returns, the problem of single cases where frequency makes no sense, the problem that different sequences can have the same frequency but seem to have different probabilities, and the debate between subjective and objective interpretations of probability remains unresolved. Remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of science and epistemology. Remains a place where intuition gives conflicting verdicts, and mathematics does not uniquely determine the right answer. The Monty Hall problem can be generalized, can be seen as an instance of a broader phenomenon where updating on evidence is counterintuitive, where the correct probability depends on assumptions about the process that generated the evidence, about whether the host had to open a door with a goat or could have opened any door, about whether the host knows where the car is or is opening doors randomly, and changing these assumptions changes the correct answer, changes whether switching is advantageous, and this shows that probability is not just about counting possibilities, but about modelling processes, about understanding the causal structure that generates observations, about getting the model right before applying the mathematics. And humans are bad at this, bad at seeing which model applies, bad at noticing when assumptions have changed, bad at tracking the difference between probability given this model and probability given that model. And this is another way intuition fails, another place where what seems obvious is wrong, another demonstration that probabilistic reasoning is hard, harder than it seems, harder than most people realize. The three prisoners problem is similar. Three prisoners, one will be pardoned, a guard knows who but will not tell. One prisoner asks the guard to name one of the other prisoners who will not be pardoned. The guard names one, and the prisoner reasons that his probability of pardon has increased from 1/3 to 1/2 because now there are only two prisoners in the running. But this reasoning is wrong. His probability is still 1/3. The other prisoner's probability is now 2/3. And this is the same structure as Monty Hall, the same failure of intuition, the same mistake of thinking that eliminating one possibility distributes its probability equally among the remainder, when really the distribution depends on how the elimination happened, on whether it was random or constrained by knowledge. And the fact that the same mistake appears in different guises, that people make the same error repeatedly, even after being corrected, suggests this is not a mistake about particular problems, but a mistake about how probability works. A fundamental misunderstanding of conditional probability, of updating, of what it means for probabilities to change in light of evidence. Simpson's paradox is another case where intuition fails, where a trend appears in several groups, but reverses when the groups are combined, where a treatment seems effective in every subgroup but harmful overall, where the correct probability judgment depends on which level of description you adopt, which grouping you consider relevant, and there is often no mathematical fact about which grouping is right, only substantive judgment about causal structure, about which variables are relevant, about what the right reference class is, and this is the reference class problem again. The problem that probability requires not just mathematics but modelling, not just calculation, but judgment, and judgment can be wrong in ways that calculation cannot, can depend on intuitions that mislead, can vary between people who have access to the same mathematical facts, and this means that probabilistic rationality is not purely formal, not reducible to following rules, not something that could be programmed into a computer without also giving the computer the ability to model the world, to understand causal structure, to make substantive judgments about relevance and independence, and which factors matter. And these abilities seem to require something like understanding, something like intelligence, something that goes beyond computation in any narrow sense. The Sleeping Beauty problem pushes this even further. Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, she is woken on Monday, and the experiment ends. If tails, she is woken on Monday, put back to sleep with memory erasure, and woken again on Tuesday. And when she wakes, she knows all this, but not what day it is or how the coin landed. And she's asked what probability she should assign to heads. And one argument says 1/2 because it is a fair coin, and her evidence does not distinguish heads from tails. And another argument says 1/3 because there are 3 possible wakings: Monday heads, Monday tails, Tuesday tails, and she should be equally uncertain about which one she is experiencing. And both arguments seem compelling. Both seem to capture something right about probability, but they give different answers, and philosophers have divided into halfers and thirders, have written papers and books arguing for their position, and no consensus has emerged, no decisive argument has appeared. And this suggests that probability itself is ambiguous, that there is no fact of the matter about. What probability means in cases like this, that different probability concepts give different answers, and there is no neutral standpoint from which to say which concept is correct. And if this is true, then rationality does not uniquely determine belief, does not provide the kind of objective standard that Bayesianism promised, allows for rational disagreement, even given identical evidence and identical priors in some sense. And this is disturbing, suggests that rationality is weaker than we thought, less constraining, less objective, more dependent on choices about how to frame problems and which probability concept to apply. The fine-tuning argument in philosophy of religion uses probability reasoning that many find suspicious, claims that the probability of a life-permitting universe is extremely low on naturalism, but not as low on theism, and therefore the existence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for theism. And this argument has the structure of Bayesian inference, has priors and likelihoods, and posteriors, but the probabilities involved seem impossible to specify, seem to require knowing about the space of possible universes and the probability distribution over them, and whether such probabilities even make sense. And skeptics argue that the argument trades on intuitions about probability that are as unreliable as the intuition that switching does not matter in Monty Hall, that it smuggles in assumptions through choices about reference classes, that it treats unknown probabilities as if they were 50-50 when there is no justification for this, and defenders argue that this is the only way to reason about such questions. That probability is the language of uncertainty, and if we cannot use probability, we cannot reason about unlikely events at all. And both sides seem right in some sense. Both seem to be pointing to real problems, and the debate remains unresolved because there is no agreed standard for when probability reasoning applies, for what makes a probability assignment reasonable, for how to choose reference classes in novel situations. The anthropic principle raises similar issues. The observation that we exist as observers places constraints on what we can observe. We cannot observe universes that do not permit observers, and this truism has been turned into arguments about probability, about whether observer selection effects should change our credences, about whether the fact that we are here is evidence for multiverse theories or fine-tuning or something else, and different formulations of the anthropic principle give different answers. The self-sampling assumption says you should reason as if you are a random sample from all observers. The self-indication assumption says you should favour theories that predict more observers, and these give conflicting recommendations, give different probabilities for the same observations, and there is no consensus about which is correct, no compelling argument that one captures rationality and the other does not. And this is another instance of the general problem, that probability reasoning requires background assumptions, requires choices about how to set up the problem, and these choices are not dictated by probability theory itself, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of objective, rational constraint that would make probabilistic epistemology a complete theory of rational belief. The possibility remains that human intuition about probability, despite being systematically wrong in many cases, is right in some deeper sense, is adapted to a different kind of rationality than mathematical probability captures, is tuned to ecological rather than abstract problems, to frequencies encountered in real environments rather than to single-case probabilities in artificial puzzles. And Gigerenzer has argued exactly this, has argued that humans are better at frequency reasoning than probability reasoning, that framing Monty Hall in terms of frequencies rather than probabilities makes the right answer intuitive, that many of the biases Kahneman and Tversky documented disappear when problems are presented in ways that match our evolutionary history. And this suggests that the problem is not with human rationality, but with the mismatch between how probability theory frames problems and how human minds naturally frame them. And if this is right, then the solution is not to train people to be more Bayesian, but to recognize that formal probability is one tool among many, appropriate for some contexts but not others, and that intuitive reasoning has its own logic, its own standards, its own domain of applicability, and trying to replace it entirely with formal calculation would be a mistake, would lose something valuable, would sacrifice the kind of quick approximate reasoning that actually works in most real-world situations for the sake of precision that is rarely achievable and often not worth the computational cost. There are no moral rules, no principles that hold across all situations, no universal guidelines that can be written down and followed like instructions for assembling furniture, and this is not because morality is arbitrary or because ethics collapses into relativism, but because the moral quality of an action depends entirely on context, on the particular features of the particular situation, on the way reasons interact and combine and transform each other in ways that resist codification, resist generalization, resist the kind of systematic thinking that philosophy has pursued for thousands of years. Jonathan Dancy calls this moral particularism, the view that ethical judgment does not require principles, that one can be a perfectly competent moral agent without believing in rules, without consulting maxims, without checking whether an action conforms to some universal law. Because morality emerges from the details, from the specific configuration of factors that make this situation different from every other situation, and what is right here may be wrong there. Not because the rule changed, but because there was never a rule to begin with, only the illusion of one, only the human tendency to see patterns where there is only particularity, only the desperate need for certainty in a domain that offers none. Aristotle glimpsed this. He said that ethics was not like mathematics, that it dealt with things that held for the most part, that moral judgment required phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to perceive what matters in a situation and respond appropriately. And this could not be reduced to rule following, could not be taught through principles alone, because wisdom was about seeing, about recognizing the morally salient features, about knowing which factors counted and which did not. And this knowledge came from experience, from immersion in the messy particularity of human life, from confronting situations that resisted easy categorization, that demanded attention to what was actually there, rather than what the theory said should be there. Kant tried to eliminate this messiness. He wanted ethics to be like geometry, certain and universal and necessary, and he argued that moral worth came only from acting according to principle, from following the categorical imperative, from treating humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And this sounded rigorous. It sounded like progress, like philosophy finally getting serious about ethics. But Dantzi argues that Kant's entire project was misconceived, that the search for moral principles was a mistake from the start, that principles do not capture what matters morally. They obscure it. They force attention away from the particular situation and toward abstract rules that may not apply, that may distort judgment rather than guide it. Consider lying. Kant said lying was always wrong, always a violation of duty, always impermissible regardless of consequences. And this seems clear, seems like the kind of principle ethics needs. But Dantzi asks us to imagine cases. A murderer comes to the door and asks where your friend is hiding. Do you tell the truth? Do you follow the principle, even when it leads to horror? And Kant, remarkably, said that lying was wrong, even here, even when truth enables murder. And this is where the principle reveals its inadequacy, its blindness to context, its inability to track what actually matters in the situation, which is not the abstract wrongness of lying, but the concrete reality of a life in danger, of a choice between honesty and complicity in violence. Mill tried to fix this with consequentialism, with the principle of utility, the idea that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they promote suffering. And this seems more flexible, more sensitive to outcomes, more attuned to what actually matters. But Dantzi argues that consequentialism is just another form of generalism, another attempt to reduce morality to a principle. And the principle fails in the same way. It forces all situations through a single lens. It demands that everything be translated into units of pleasure and pain. It ignores the particular features that make one situation different from another, the commitments and relationships and histories that shape what is owed to whom, that make some considerations relevant and others not. And no principle can capture this. No rule can account for the holism of reasons, the way moral factors interact in ways that are not additive, not combinable according to fixed formulas, but emergent, context-dependent, irreducibly particular. The holism of reasons is Dantzi's central insight, the idea that a feature that counts in favour of an action in one context might count against it in another, or might be morally neutral in a third. And this is not because the principle changed, but because there is no principle. Only the way reasons function in concrete situations. Consider pleasure. It seems like a good making feature, something that counts in favour of an action, but the pleasure taken in another's suffering is not good, it is contemptible. It transforms what might have been a reason into something else entirely, and this transformation is not rule-governed. It emerges from the particular configuration of features, from the relationship between pleasure and cruelty, between satisfaction and harm. And no principle can predict this in advance. No rule can tell you when pleasure counts positively and when it does not, because the answer depends on details that resist formalization, that require attention to the specific case, to the particular way elements combine and interact and generate moral significance. Ross saw this problem and tried to solve it with prima facie duties, with the idea that principles hold other things being equal, that there are multiple duties that can conflict, and when they conflict, one must judge which is weightier in the particular situation. And this seems like a compromise between generalism and particularism, a way to preserve principles while acknowledging context. But Dance argues that prima facie duties do not solve the problem, they only relocate it, because the judgment of which duty is weightier is itself particularist. It requires attention to the specific features of the situation. It requires exactly the kind of moral perception that particularism emphasizes. And if that perception is doing all the work, if the real moral judgment happens when deciding between competing duties, then the principles are not guiding action. They are just labels for types of considerations, and the substantive work is being done by particularist judgment, by the ability to see what matters here and now, not by consulting rules, but by attending to reality. Hare tried to rescue generalism with supervenience, with the idea that if two situations are identical in their natural properties, they must be identical in their moral properties, that moral facts supervene on natural facts. And this seems right. It seems like a minimal constraint on moral judgment, that one cannot say this action is right, and that action is wrong if they are exactly the same in every non-moral respect. But Dance accepts supervenience while denying that it entails generalism, because supervenience is just the claim that morality is not arbitrary, that it tracks features of situations, but it does not follow that those features function according to principles, that they behave the same way in every context, that they can be codified into rules. And this is the crucial distinction between the idea that morality is reason responsive, that it answers to facts about situations, and the idea that it is principle-based, that it can be systematized into universal laws. And Dance argues that the first is true and the second is false, that ethics is responsive to reasons without being governed by principles, that judgment can be rational without being rule-following, that one can give explanations for moral claims without appealing to generalizations. This seems strange. It seems like judgment without principles must be arbitrary, must be mere intuition, mere feeling, mere subjective response. And this is the standard objection to particularism, the charge that it collapses into relativism or emotivism or some form of irrationalism. But Dance insists that particularist judgment is rational, that it can be defended, can be explained, can be argued for. But the defense does not take the form of deriving the judgment from a principle. It takes the form of pointing to features of the situation, of saying, look at this, see how it matters, see how it combines with that to generate this moral requirement. And this is not irrational. It is not arbitrary. It is simply a different form of rationality, one that operates at the level of the particular rather than the universal, one that trusts perception rather than deduction, one that recognizes that moral reality is too complex, too context-dependent, too holistic to be captured in rules. Wittgenstein would have recognized this. His discussions of rule-following showed that rules do not apply themselves, that every application of a rule requires interpretation, requires judgment about whether this case falls under the rule, and that judgment cannot itself be rule-governed on pain of infinite regress. And this means that, at some point, judgment must be direct, must be a matter of seeing how to go on, of recognizing the similarity or difference without consulting a further rule. And if this is true for linguistic rules, it is even more true for moral rules, where the situations are more complex, the factors more numerous, the interactions more unpredictable, and the idea that one could capture all of this in a set of principles seems not just difficult, but incoherent, seems to misunderstand what morality is, how it functions, what it demands of moral agents. McDowell follows this line. He argues that moral knowledge is perceptual, that the virtuous person sees what is required, sees the morally salient features the way one might see that a painting is balanced, or that a joke is cruel. And this seeing is not mediated by principles, it is direct responsiveness to features of the situation. And someone who lacks this responsiveness, who cannot see what matters, cannot be helped by being given rules. Because the problem is not that they do not know the rules, but that they do not see what the rules are supposed to be about. They lack the sensibility that makes moral judgment possible. And this sensibility is developed through experience, through habituation, through becoming the kind of person who attends to certain features and responds to them appropriately. And this is not a matter of internalizing principles, but of refining perception, of learning to see what matters and why it matters and how it matters in this particular case. But if morality does not require principles, if particularism is true, then what happens to moral education, to the teaching of ethics, to the possibility of moral progress and moral reform? Because it seems like without principles, there is no way to criticize existing practices, no standpoint from which to say that this is wrong, no foundation for moral argument. And Dancy's response is that criticism does not require principles, that one can point to features of a situation and show that they matter, that they generate reasons, that current practice fails to recognize them. And this is how moral progress happens, not through the discovery of new principles, but through the expansion of moral perception, through learning to see what was always there but previously ignored, like the suffering of animals, like the dignity of marginalized groups, like the long-term consequences of environmental destruction. And these insights are not derived from principles, but from attention to particulars, from refusing to look away, from recognizing that features previously dismissed as irrelevant are in fact morally significant. And this recognition does not require a theory, it requires only the willingness to look, to attend, to respond. Murdoch understood this deeply. She argued that morality was about attention, about the quality of consciousness one brings to situations, about whether one sees clearly or through the distorting lens of selfishness, fear, resentment, pride. And the moral task was not to follow rules, but to purify vision, to remove the obstacles that prevent one from seeing reality as it is. And this was a lifetime's work, a continuous effort of reorientation, of turning away from fantasy and toward truth. And principles could not do this work. They could not force vision. They could not compel attention. They were at best crude summaries of what attentive people had noticed, and at worst they were substitutes for attention, shortcuts that allowed people to think they were being moral without actually looking at what was in front of them, without confronting the particular human being, the particular situation, the particular constellation of factors that demanded response. Levinas took this even further. He argued that ethics began not with principles, but with the face of the other, with the encounter that precedes all theory, all system, all generalization, and the face makes a demand, a wordless claim that cannot be ignored, cannot be systematized, cannot be reduced to rules, and responsibility emerges in that encounter, not from duty, not from utility, not from virtue, but from the sheer fact of the other's vulnerability, the other's dependence, the other's irreplaceable singularity. And every attempt to capture this in principles misses what matters, abstracts away the particular person standing before you, replaces the face with a category, replaces the singular with the general. And this is not ethical thinking, but it's evasion, not responsibility, but the flight from responsibility into the comfort of rules that tell you what to do. So you do not have to look, do not have to see, do not have to respond to what is actually there. Yet the pull toward principles persists, the need to generalize, to systematize, to find order in the chaos of moral life. And this need is not irrational. It reflects something deep in human cognition, the tendency to abstract, to categorize, to find patterns, and in many domains this serves us well. Science progresses through generalization, through finding laws that apply across cases, through ignoring particularity in favor of universality. But Dancy argues that ethics is not like science, that moral properties do not behave like natural properties, that the search for moral laws is misguided not because we have not found them yet, but because they do not exist, because the moral domain is constitutively particular, irreducibly context-dependent, resistant to the kind of systematization that works elsewhere. This does not mean ethics is subjective, does not mean moral judgments are arbitrary, does not mean anything goes. It means only that moral truth is complex, that it emerges from the interplay of factors in particular situations, that it requires attention and judgment rather than calculation and rule following. And the person who wants certainty, who wants an algorithm for ethics, who wants to know in advance what the right answer is asking for something ethics cannot provide. Not because ethics is deficient, but because that is not what ethics is, not what it has ever been, not what it could be without ceasing to be about the messy, complicated, particular reality of human life. The implications of this extend into every corner of moral philosophy, into debates about action and character, about consequentialism and deontology, about the nature of reasons and the structure of normativity. Because if particularism is true, then the entire framework of traditional ethics must be reconsidered, the search for supreme principles abandoned, the hope for moral certainty relinquished, the dream of ethics as a deductive science dissolved, and what replaces it is something humbler, something more difficult, something that requires not cleverness but wisdom, not logic but perception, not theory but attention to the infinite complexity of actual situations. And this is harder, requires more from moral agents, demands that they develop sensitivity rather than memorize rules, that they cultivate character rather than learn formulas, that they become the kind of people who can see what matters rather than the kind who can apply principles. And this cannot be taught in classrooms, cannot be reduced to curriculum, cannot be tested with examinations. It requires living, requires experience, requires the slow accumulation of cases and responses and reflections that gradually shape perception, that refine judgment, that make one capable of navigating moral reality without the crutch of principles. Consider promising. It seems like a clear case for principles. You ought to keep your promises. Seems as close to a moral rule as anything gets. And yet even here context intrudes. A promise made under duress does not bind. A promise to do something immoral should be broken. A promise that circumstances have rendered impossible does not generate obligation. And the more one examines promising, the more exceptions appear. The more qualifications are needed. And at some point the principle becomes so hedged with caveats that it ceases to be a principle at all. It becomes merely a placeholder, a reminder that promises generally matter. But the real work is done by judgment, by the ability to see which features of this particular promise are morally relevant, whether it was freely given, whether circumstances have changed, whether keeping it would cause harm, whether breaking it would violate trust. And these considerations do not combine according to a formula. They do not add up mechanically. They interact holistically, each modifying the significance of the others. And the person who simply applies a rule about promise-keeping without attending to these particulars is not being moral. They're being obtuse. They are substituting mechanical rule-following for genuine ethical response. The same pattern appears everywhere, in questions of truth-telling and confidentiality, of loyalty and fairness, of care and justice. Every apparent principle dissolves under scrutiny into a complex web of context, dependent considerations, and the moral agent must navigate this web without a map, must see what matters without consulting a guidebook, must respond to reality as it is rather than as theories say it should be. And this is difficult. This is uncertain. This leaves room for disagreement and error. But it is also more honest, more true to actual moral experience, more respectful of the complexity of human life than any theory that tries to reduce ethics to a set of rules that can be mechanically applied. Nietzsche saw the damage that moral principles could do, the way they flattened life, reduced rich particular situations to instances of abstract categories, forced living, breathing human interactions into rigid molds. And he attacked what he called slave morality, the morality of rules and duties and universal principles. Not because he thought ethics was impossible, but because he thought this kind of ethics was life-denying. It served the weak at the expense of the strong. It suppressed excellence in favor of equality. It demanded conformity rather than creativity. And true morality, Nietzsche thought, would be particular, would be about the individual creating their own values in response to their own situation, about saying yes to life in all its particularity rather than subjecting it to the tyranny of universal laws. And while Dancy would not follow Nietzsche all the way into this radical individualism, there is something shared here, a recognition that principles can be oppressive, that they can prevent genuine moral response, that attention to particulars is not a failure of ethics but its essence. Yet there remains the worry about disagreement, because if morality is not governed by principles, then what happens when people disagree? How can disputes be resolved? What court of appeal exists? And the generalist thinks principles solve this? That if both parties accept the same principles, they can reason their way to agreement. But this assumes that moral disagreement is always about the application of shared principles, and often it is not. Often people disagree about what matters, about which features are salient, about how considerations combine. And in these cases, principles do not help. They just disguise the disagreement, make it look like a technical dispute about application, when really it is a substantive dispute about perception. And the particularist accepts this, accepts that some disagreements cannot be resolved by argument, that they reflect different ways of seeing, different sensibilities, different forms of attention. And this is not relativism, because it does not deny that one view might be right and the other wrong. It just denies that the rightness can always be demonstrated through principles, that it can always be made compelling to someone who does not already see what matters. And this means that moral education is not about teaching principles, but about training perception, about learning to see what the virtuous person sees. And this is slow, difficult, uncertain work, but it is the only work that matters, the only work that produces genuine moral agents, rather than rule followers who think ethics is about checking boxes and following procedures. The legal system provides a useful contrast, because law requires principles, requires rules that can be codified and applied consistently, requires the ability to determine guilt and innocence through procedures rather than perception. And this is appropriate for law because law serves different purposes. It needs predictability, needs equality before the rules, needs the ability to hold people accountable in ways that do not depend on individual judgment. But morality is not law. Moral judgment is not legal judgment, and the attempt to make morality like law, to replace wisdom with rules, to substitute codification for perception, is a category mistake. It imports into ethics standards that belong elsewhere. that serve different purposes, that distort what morality is actually about, which is responding appropriately to particular situations rather than applying general rules, which is seeing what matters rather than calculating what is required, which is being a certain kind of person rather than following a certain kind of procedure. The illusion of pure presence. Western philosophy has been obsessed with presence, with the idea that meaning is fully present to consciousness, that words capture thoughts directly, that speech delivers truth immediately, that understanding happens in a moment of transparent access where mind grasps reality without mediation, without delay, without the contamination of signs and symbols. And this obsession runs from Plato through Descartes to Husserl, this dream of pure presence, of meaning that is simply there, fully present, completely accessible, uncontaminated by absence or difference or time. And Derrida spent his career showing that this dream is impossible, that presence is always haunted by absence, that meaning is never fully present, but always deferred, always dependent on what is not there, always structured by difference and delay. And this critique he called the deconstruction of logocentrism, the deconstruction of the metaphysics of presence, the showing that what philosophy took as foundational, what it built everything on, what it never questioned, was actually an illusion, a construction, a denial of what makes meaning possible in the first place. Logocentrism is the privileging of speech over writing, the assumption that spoken language is primary, is closer to thought, is more authentic, is the natural expression of meaning, while writing is secondary, is derivative, is a mere representation of speech, a supplement that adds nothing essential, that could be eliminated without loss. And this privilege appears everywhere in philosophy, appears in Plato's suspicion of writing in the Phaedrus, appears in Rousseau's claim that writing corrupts natural speech, appears in Saussure's insistence that linguistics should study speech, not writing, appears in Husserl's phenomenology, where meaning is supposed to be present to consciousness. In the living voice, in the moment of speaking, where thought and expression coincide, where there is no gap, no mediation, no absence, just the full presence of meaning to itself. And Derrida argues that this entire structure is based on a mistake, that speech is not privileged, that it depends on the same structures of absence and difference that characterize writing, that the opposition between speech and writing is false, that what philosophy tried to exclude, tried to marginalize, tried to treat as secondary, is actually constitutive, is what makes meaning possible, and recognizing this requires rethinking everything philosophy has assumed about language and meaning and presence. The argument begins with Saussure, who showed that linguistic signs are arbitrary, that the connection between signifier and signified is conventional, not natural, that there is no resemblance between the sound tree and actual trees, that meaning comes not from positive content but from difference, from the fact that tree is not free, is not three, is not any other word, that each sign gets its meaning from its position in a system of differences, from what it is not rather than from what it is. And this means meaning is never simply present in a sign, is never contained in it, is always dependent on absence, on all the other signs that are not present but that structure, the meaning of this sign through their absence, through the differences that define the system. And if meaning comes from difference, then it comes from what is absent, comes from the traces of other signs, comes from a structure that cannot be present all at once, that exceeds any moment of presence. That means presence is always already contaminated by absence, always already structured by what is not there. Derrida takes this insight further with his concept of difference, spelled with an A instead of an E to mark a difference that cannot be heard in speech, that exists only in writing. And this spelling already undermines the privilege of speech, already shows that writing can mark distinctions, that speech cannot, that writing is not simply a representation of speech, but has its own resources, its own capacities, its own forms of meaning, and difference is a neologism that combines two French verbs, differ a meaning to differ, and differ a meaning to differ. And Derrida uses this to capture the double movement of meaning. Meaning as difference. As we saw in Saussure, meaning comes from signs being different from each other, but also meaning as deferral. Meaning is never fully present because it always refers beyond itself, always points to other signs, always defers its completion, always postpones the full presence that philosophy dreams of. And this deferral is not an accident, not a limitation that could be overcome, but is the structure of meaning itself. Meaning is essentially deferral, is essentially the play of references that never comes to rest, never achieves the self-presence that would end the chain of signification. The trace is another key concept. The trace is what remains of absence, is the mark that one sign leaves in another, is the way every sign is inhabited by what it is not, by all the differences that constitute it, and the trace is neither present nor absent, is the condition of both presence and absence, is what makes presence possible while preventing it from ever being pure. And philosophy has always tried to exclude the trace, tried to achieve pure presence, tried to eliminate mediation, tried to reach a point where thought and reality meet without the interference of signs. But this is impossible because thought is already sign, is already mediation, is already structured by difference and deferral and trace. And the dream of pure presence is the dream of a meaning that is not meaning, of a thought that is not thought, of a consciousness that transcends its own conditions of possibility. And this is why the dream always fails, why philosophy keeps encountering the same problems, why every attempt to ground meaning in presence leads to paradox and aporia, and the recognition that presence depends on what it tried to exclude. Husserl represents the culmination of the metaphysics of presence. His phenomenology tried to describe consciousness as it appears to itself, tried to bracket all questions of external reality and focus on the structures of experience. And he believed that in the living present, in the now of consciousness, meaning was fully present, that intentionality gave consciousness direct access to objects, that the voice was privileged because in speaking I hear myself speak. The signifier and the signified seem to coincide. There is no delay, no gap, no mediation, just the immediate self-presence of meaning. And Derrida's critique shows that even this privileged case depends on difference and deferral, because the now is not atomic, is not indivisible, is always already divided between past and future, between retention and protension, between what just was and what is about to be. And the pure present is impossible, is never experienced, is a theoretical construct that phenomenology posits but never demonstrates. And if the present is divided, then self-presence is divided, then the voice does not deliver unmediated meaning, but is already caught in the play of difference, already structured by trace and deferral, already contaminated by absence. The supplement is Derrida's term for what is supposed to be secondary, but turns out to be essential, what is supposed to add to something complete, but turns out to constitute it. And writing is the supplement to speech in the logocentric tradition. Writing is supposed to represent speech, to add nothing except the convenience of transmission across distance and time, to be a technology that speech could do without. But Derrida shows that speech already has the structure of writing, already involves repetition and difference and absence, already is a system of marks that function through their differences, not their presence. And what this means is that the supplement is not secondary, the supplement is originary. What seems to come after and add to is actually what makes possible what it supplements. And this reversal is characteristic of deconstruction, the showing that what the tradition marginalized as derivative is actually constitutive, that what was excluded as external is actually internal, that the hierarchy must be reversed or rather dissolved, because the terms are not opposed but entangled, and neither is prior to the other. Both depend on structures that exceed them. Rousseau provides Derrida with a key text. Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages argues that speech is natural, and writing artificial, that speech expresses passion directly while writing is cold and mediated, that the progress of civilization involves the corruption of natural speech by artificial writing, and yet Rousseau's own text undermines this claim, shows writing doing things speech cannot do, shows that even his account of natural speech describes it in terms that apply to writing, describes it as involving representation and difference and absence. And Rousseau himself acknowledges that writing supplements speech, that it is dangerous precisely because it can do what speech does without the presence of the speaker. And this danger reveals that presence was never essential, that meaning can function in the absence of the speaker, that the supplement is not secondary but reveals the structure of what it supplements, reveals that speech was always already writing in the broad sense that Derrida gives to writing, the sense of archie-writing, the structure of difference and deferral and trace that makes all meaning possible. Plato's Phaedrus contains the same tension. Socrates tells the story of Theuhi, who invented writing and offered it to the king as a gift that would improve memory, and the king rejected it, saying that writing would destroy memory, would make people dependent on external marks rather than internal knowledge, would substitute dead letters for living speech, and this criticism assumes that living speech is superior, that presence is better than absence, that memory should be internal, not external, but the dialogue itself is written, is a text that preserves Socrates' words in his absence, is writing that does what Socrates claims writing cannot do. And Derrida reads this tension as revealing the impossibility of excluding writing, the impossibility of maintaining the privilege of speech, because even the critique of writing must use writing, must rely on what it criticizes, must depend on the supplement it tries to marginalize. And this is the logic of the supplement. It shows that what is excluded is necessary, that what is denied is constitutive, that the outside is inside, that presence requires absence. The implications of this for philosophy are profound, because philosophy has always sought foundations, has always tried to find something indubitable, something fully present, something that could ground knowledge without itself needing ground. And the Cartesian cogito was supposed to be this, the I think that is present to itself, that cannot doubt itself, that provides certainty. But Derrida shows that even the cogito depends on language, depends on signs, depends on the repeatability of the I that makes it not fully singular, not fully present, because if I is a sign, then it functions only through its repeatability, only through its ability to be used again in different contexts. And this repeatability is what Derrida calls iterability, the essential repeatability of signs. And iterability introduces absence into presence, introduces difference into identity, because if the sign can be repeated, then it can be repeated in my absence, can function without me, can mean without my intending it to mean. And this shows that meaning is not controlled by intention, is not determined by what the speaker or writer means, but exceeds intention, has a life of its own, can be taken up in contexts that were not anticipated and mean things that were not intended. And this is why deconstruction can find meanings in texts that authors did not intend, can show texts undermining their own claims, can reveal tensions and contradictions that were not deliberate but that are nonetheless there in the text. And this is not misreading, not imposing meaning on the text, but is close reading, is attention to what the text says beyond what it means to say, is following the logic of the text further than the author followed it. The critique of phonocentrism, the privileging of voice and hearing over other forms of signification, extends the critique of logocentrism, because the voice was privileged precisely because it seemed to offer presence, seemed to allow the speaker to hear themselves speak, and thereby to experience meaning as present to consciousness. But Derrida shows that hearing oneself speak is not immediate, is not self-presence, because the voice must pass through the medium of sound, must be received by the ear, must be processed by the auditory system. And all of this introduces delay, introduces difference, introduces the trace, and the illusion of immediacy is just that, an illusion, a denial of the mediation that actually occurs. And if speech is mediated, then it is no different in principle from writing. Both are systems of marks that function through difference. Both involve absence and deferral. Both depend on structures that exceed presence. And the privilege of speech is revealed as metaphysical prejudice, as commitment to presence that cannot be sustained, as logocentrism. Meaning as deferred implies that meaning is never fully achieved, never complete, never final, because every attempt to state what something means requires more signs, requires more words, requires explanations that themselves require explanation. And this is not a failure, not a lack, but is the condition of meaning. Meaning is essentially open, essentially unfinished, essentially exceeds any attempt to pin it down, and interpretation is therefore infinite, not because meanings are arbitrary, but because meanings are inexhaustible, because every text can be read in multiple ways, can support multiple interpretations, not because anything goes, but because the text itself is structured by difference, is itself a play of differences that no single reading can master. And this does not make interpretation hopeless, but makes it necessary, makes it an ongoing task, makes it something that cannot be completed but must be continually undertaken. The political implications are significant because deconstruction reveals that all binary oppositions, all hierarchies, all claims to pure presence or pure identity are unstable, are constructed, are maintained through exclusion and denial. And this applies to oppositions like man/woman, white/non-white, straight/queer, rational/emotional, civilized/primitive, where one term is privileged and the other marginalized. And deconstruction shows that the privileged term depends on what it excludes, that identity depends on difference, that the center requires the margin. And this does not simply reverse the hierarchy, does not simply elevate what was marginalized, but shows that the hierarchy itself is unstable, that both terms are caught in a play of differences that prevents either from being pure or self-sufficient. And recognizing this opens possibilities for rethinking identity, for questioning foundations, for challenging power structures that present themselves as natural or necessary. And this is why deconstruction has been politically controversial, why it has been embraced by some as liberatory and attacked by others as nihilistic, why it continues to generate debate about whether undermining foundations strengthens or weakens resistance to injustice. Critics argue that deconstruction is self-refuting, that if all meaning is deferred, then deconstruction itself has no stable meaning, that if presence is impossible, then Derrida cannot mean what he says, cannot expect to be understood, cannot make claims that others can grasp. But this misses the point because deconstruction does not claim that meaning is impossible, does not deny that communication works, does not embrace skepticism or relativism. It claims only that meaning is not what philosophy thought it was, is not presence but deferral, is not self-sufficient but depends on difference. And this does not prevent communication, but explains how communication is possible, explains how signs can function in the absence of their origins, how text can be understood by readers who do not know the author, how meaning can survive contexts and travel across time and space. And all of this is possible because meaning is not tied to presence, because it depends on structures that exceed any moment of presence, because difference is not a limitation, but the condition of possibility of meaning itself. Death is not the opposite of life, but is its condition, is not the ending that comes after, but is the pressure that shapes everything, is the fact that makes every moment matter or makes nothing matter, depending on perspective, depending on whether the awareness of mortality is conscious or is repressed, is acknowledged or is denied. And the denial is the default, is the way that most humans live most of the time, is the forgetting of death that allows daily life to proceed, that allows plans to be made, that allows the future to seem real, to seem like something that will arrive, that will be inhabited, when really the future is uncertain, is not guaranteed, is always potentially not happening because death is always possible, is always near, is the horizon that surrounds every moment, even though the horizon is not seen, is not acknowledged, is pushed to the edges of consciousness, where it operates without being noticed. And the operating is what terror management theory describes, is what Ernest Becker analysed, is what philosophers from Epicurus to Heidegger have recognised, which is that death is the organising principle, is the fact that structures behaviour, that shapes culture, that creates the need for meaning, for legacy, for something that will persist beyond the mortal body, beyond the temporary consciousness, beyond the brief flicker of existence that is a human life. And the brevity is what mortality means, is the recognition that time is finite, that the days are numbered, that eventually, inevitably, certainly the ending will come. And the coming is what humans cannot accept, cannot tolerate, cannot integrate into consciousness without the help of mechanisms that soften the blow, that make death seem distant, that create the illusion of immortality through legacy, through children, through achievements, through the leaving of marks that will persist, that will remain, that will mean that the person was here, mattered, existed in a way that death cannot erase. And the erasing is what death does, is the return to nothing, is the elimination of the perspective, the ending of the experience, the cessation of being, and being is what consciousness is the only thing that is known directly, is the only certainty, and death is the end of certainty, is the movement from being to not being, from existence to non-existence, from something to nothing, and the nothing is unimaginable, is not representable, is not something that can be experienced, because experience requires existence, and death is the end of existence, and so death cannot be known, cannot be prepared for, cannot be understood except as concept, as abstraction, as the thing that happens to others, but not to oneself, because oneself is always here, is always now, is always being, and being cannot imagine not being, cannot grasp what it would mean to not exist. And so the grasping fails, the imagination fails, and what remains is anxiety, is the terror that Becker named, is the fundamental horror of mortality that underlies all human striving, all cultural creation, all the symbolic systems that humans build to deny death, to transcend death, to make death seem like something other than what it is, which is the end, the absolute end, the final end. And the finality is what cannot be accepted, is what the symbolic systems are designed to obscure, to soften, to make bearable. And the bearing is what culture does, is what religion provides, is what meaning creates, is the framework that makes mortality tolerable by promising that death is not the end, is not final, is not the absolute cessation, but is transition, is passage, is the movement from this life to another life, from this world to another world, from temporality to eternity. And eternity is the solution, is the promise that makes death bearable, is the belief that the self will continue, will persist, will exist in some form beyond the death of the body. And the beyond is what religions offer, is what makes them powerful, is what makes them necessary. Because without the promise of continuation, without the belief in something after, death is unbearable, is too horrifying, is too final, and the finality is what humans flee from, is what drives the creation of culture, of meaning, of all the systems that provide the illusion of permanence in a world where nothing is permanent, where everything ends, where death is the only certainty, and the certainty is denied, is repressed, is pushed into unconsciousness, where it continues to operate, continues to shape behaviour, continues to create the anxiety that motivates striving, that produces the need for achievement, for recognition, for legacy. And legacy is the secular substitute for immortality, is the way that non-religious consciousness, tries to transcend death, tries to create permanence, tries to ensure that the self will continue in some form, will be remembered, will have mattered, and the mattering is what legacy provides, is the sense that the life was significant, was important, was worth living, and the worth is measured by what remains, by what persists, by what continues after death. And the continuing is children, is works, is achievements, is anything that carries the name forward, that keeps the memory alive, that prevents the erasure that death threatens. And the threat is what drives behaviour, is what shapes choices, is what makes people desperate for significance, for impact, for the leaving of marks. And the marks are what resist death, are what deny death, are what create the illusion that death is not final, is not absolute, is not the complete erasure that it actually is. Because what persists is not the person, is not the consciousness, is not the experience, is only memory, is only representation, is only the traces left behind. And traces are not the thing, are not the person, are not continuation, but are echoes, are shadows, are the residue of a presence that is gone. And the gone is complete, is total, is the absolute ending that no legacy can reverse, no achievement can prevent, no memory can undo. And the undoing is what humans want, is what they strive for, is what they cannot have, because death is irreversible, is final, is the one thing that cannot be changed, cannot be negotiated, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what humans are always attempting, is what drives medical science, what motivates the search for longevity, for life extension, for the postponement of death. And the postponement is possible, is achievable, is happening, is increasing lifespan, is pushing death further into the future. But the pushing is not eliminating, is not transcending, is only delaying, is only buying time. And time is what mortality is about, is the finite duration, is the numbered days, and the numbering is what creates urgency, is what makes moments precious, is what gives life its intensity. And the intensity is what would be lost if death were eliminated, if immortality were achieved, if time were infinite, because infinite time means that nothing is urgent, nothing is precious, nothing matters in the way that it matters when time is scarce, when death is near, when the ending is certain. And the certainty is what gives weight to life, is what makes choices matter, is what creates the pressure to live well, to live fully, to use the time that is available. And the available is limited, is finite, is running out. And the running out is what creates anxiety, is what produces terror, is what makes death unbearable, but is also what makes life meaningful, is what gives moments their significance, is what creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. This is real. This is happening now, and will never happen again. And the never again is both the horror and the beauty of mortality, is both what makes death terrible and what makes life precious. And the precious is what immortality would eliminate, is what infinite time would destroy, because in infinite time, everything can be redone, can be repeated, can be postponed indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the loss of urgency, is the elimination of pressure, is the removal of the condition that makes life matter. And the mattering would fade, would disappear, would be replaced by ennui, by boredom, by the sense that nothing is important because everything is always available, always possible, always able to be done later, and later never comes, never needs to come, because there is always more time, always more opportunity, always more future. And the future without end is not liberation, but is prison, is not freedom, but is curse, is the elimination of the one thing that makes life bearable, which is its finitude, its limit, its ending. And the ending is what humans fear most, but is also what makes everything else possible, makes meaning possible, makes value possible, makes the sense that this matters, that this is important, that this should be done now. And the now is what mortality creates, is the urgency, is the pressure, is the recognition that time is limited and must be used, must be filled, must be lived, and the living is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the awareness of mortality produces. When the awareness is not repressed, is not denied, is allowed into consciousness where it can shape behavior, not through terror but through acceptance, through the recognition that death is inevitable, and therefore life is precious, is limited, is the opportunity that will not repeat, and the not repeating is what makes each moment unique, makes each experience singular, makes each person irreplaceable, because death means that this person, this consciousness, this particular way of being in the world will end, will cease, will never exist again. And the never again is both loss and gift, is both what is mourned and what is celebrated. Because mortality is what makes individuality possible, is what makes each person unique, is what ensures that no life is the same as any other life. And the sameness would be what immortality would produce, would be the eventual repetition, the exhaustion of novelty, the sense that everything has been done, has been experienced, has been lived through too many times. And the too many times is what infinite time produces, is the curse of repetition, is the horror of eternity, is the recognition that immortality would not be paradise, but would be hell, would be the endless continuation of existence without purpose, without end, without the relief that death provides. And the relief is what death is the ending of suffering, is the cessation of striving, is the peace that comes from completion, from finality, from the recognition that it is over, is done, is finished. And the finishing is what gives shape to life, is what makes it a story, is what creates the arc from beginning to end. And the end is what gives the beginning meaning, is what makes the middle matter, is what ensures that the story has significance, has weight, has the structure that makes it comprehensible. And comprehensible is what life becomes when death is acknowledged, when mortality is accepted, when the ending is recognized as necessary, as the condition that makes everything else possible. And the possible is what humans are living, is the space between birth and death, is the time that is given, is the opportunity to exist, to experience, to be. And the being is temporary, is finite, is ending. And the ending is approaching, is always approaching, is getting closer with every moment, with every breath, with every heartbeat. And the heartbeats are numbered, are counted, are finite. And the finite is what makes them precious, is what makes each beat matter, is what creates the urgency to live, to experience, to be fully present in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching zero, and the zero is death, is the ending, is the return to nothing. And the nothing is what was before birth and will be after death, is the condition from which life emerges and to which it returns. And the return is inevitable, is certain, is the one appointment that cannot be missed, cannot be postponed indefinitely, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what modern medicine attempts, is what life extension promises, is what cryonics offers, is the denial of death through technology, through science, through the belief that death is a problem that can be solved, is a disease that can be cured, is an enemy that can be defeated. And the defeating is what death denial looks like in secular culture, is the medicalization of mortality, is the treatment of death as failure, as something that should not happen, as something to be prevented, to be delayed, to be fought against. With every resource available, and the available resources are considerable, are increasing, are pushing death further back, are extending life further forward, but are not eliminating death, are not making immortality actual, are only postponing the inevitable, are only delaying the ending. And the delaying is creating new problems, is producing extended old age, is generating years of decline, of deterioration, of the slow failing of the body and the mind. And the failing is what modern medicine has not solved has not prevented, has only extended, has only made longer, and the longer is not always better, is not always desirable, is sometimes the prolongation of suffering, the extension of indignity, the continuation of existence beyond the point where existence is meaningful, where life is life rather than mere biological persistence, and the persistence is what modern medicine achieves, is what technology provides, is the keeping alive of bodies that would otherwise die, that should die, that are ready to die, but are prevented from dying by interventions that maintain biological function without maintaining experience, without maintaining quality, without maintaining what makes life worth living. And the worth living is what death denial sacrifices, is what the fight against mortality costs, is the recognition that sometimes death is mercy, is relief, is the appropriate ending, is what should happen, and the should is what modern culture has lost, is what medical ethics struggles with, is what the denial of death prevents from. Being acknowledged, which is that death is natural, is necessary, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life meaningful, that creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. And the mattering is what death creates, is what mortality produces, is the mathematics that structures behaviour, that shapes choices, that organises life around the fact of ending. And the fact is undeniable, is certain, is the one truth that applies to everyone, that no one escapes, that makes all humans equal in the end. And the end is what is shared, is what connects, is what makes mortality not just individual, but collective, not just personal, but universal. Not just my death, but death itself, the death that comes for everyone. That structures all life, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the terror, the meaning, the value, the sense that time is limited and must be used, must be lived, must be filled with experience, with connection, with love, with the things that make existence worthwhile. And the worthwhile is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the mathematics of mortality reveals, which is that death is not the enemy, but is the condition, is not the opposite of life, but is its structure, is not what ends meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what should be denied, but is what should be accepted, is what should be acknowledged, is what should be integrated into consciousness, into culture, into the way that life is lived. And the living is what matters, is what the mathematics of mortality teaches, which is that death is certain, time is finite, moments are precious, and the precious is what remains, is what persists, is the experience of being alive, of being conscious, of being here now, in the time that is given, in the space between birth and death, in the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that makes everything matter, and the mattering is mortality, is death, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life life, that creates the conditions for meaning, for value, for the sense that this is important, that this is real, that this is happening, and the happening is temporary, is finite, is ending, and the ending is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the gift that death gives, which is the recognition that life is limited, is scarce, is valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be experienced, should be embraced, not denied, not postponed, not feared, but accepted, acknowledged, integrated, and the integration is what makes mortality bearable, is what transforms terror into meaning, is what converts the mathematics of death into the mathematics of life. And the life is here, is now, is finite, is ending, and the ending is approaching, is certain, is the fact that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the urgency to live, to be, to exist fully in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching the end, and the end is death, is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition, is what makes life life. And life is what matters, is what is given, is what is ending, and the ending is the gift, is the meaning, is the mathematics of mortality that structures all human behaviour, all human striving, all human meaning. And the meaning is that death is certain, life is finite, time is limited, and the limited is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the only thing that matters, which is the time between now and death, the space between birth and ending, the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that is mortality, that is death, that is the fact that cannot be escaped, cannot be denied, cannot be defeated, can only be accepted, acknowledged, lived with. And the living with is what makes life meaningful, is what transforms terror into purpose, is what converts the mathematics of death into the gift of life. And the gift is finite, is ending, is approaching zero. And the zero is death, is the end, is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the meaning. And the meaning is that life is limited, death is certain, time is running out, and the running out is what makes now matter, is what makes this moment precious, is what makes existence valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be embraced, should be experienced fully. Because the mathematics of mortality reveals that death is not the enemy, but is the teacher, is not what destroys meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what ends life, but is what makes life life, is the certainty, is the fact, is the mathematics that structures all human behaviour, all human striving, all human existence, and the existence is finite, is ending, is death, and death is the mathematics, is the meaning, is the gift, is the end. Time feels like a river flowing in one direction, from past through present toward future, and this feeling is so fundamental to human experience that questioning it seems absurd, seems like denying gravity or claiming water flows upward. But the feeling of time's flow is not a direct perception of reality, but a construction, a story. The brain tells about the relationship between events, and when physicists examine the universe at its most fundamental level, they find no flow, no arrow, no distinction between past and future written into the equations, find only a four-dimensional block where all moments exist simultaneously, where what humans call past and what they call future are just directions in space-time no different than up and down, and this creates a profound puzzle, a gap between how time appears in experience and how it exists in reality, between the subjective sense of moving through time and the objective structure that contains no movement, only arrangement, only the geometry of causation. And this gap suggests that the experience of time is not a feature of the universe, but a feature of consciousness. Not something discovered, but something manufactured. And understanding how this manufacturing happens, how the brain constructs the illusion of flow from raw sensory data and memory and anticipation, reveals something strange about what humans are, about how awareness works, about the mechanisms that create the sense of being a continuous self moving through a series of moments, rather than what might actually be the case, which is that there is no continuous self, and there are no discrete moments, but only patterns of neural activity that interpret themselves as experiencing time, when really they are just responding to change, just processing difference, just comparing present states with stored representations of past states, and calling that comparison memory, calling that experience history, calling that sensation the passage of time. But the passage is metaphor, is language, trying to capture something that has no literal motion, no actual flow, because nothing is passing, nothing is moving. There is only the fact of change, the fact that one configuration of matter gives way to another configuration, and the brain, being a system that persists across configurations, that maintains some continuity of structure even as its content shifts, interprets this persistence as duration, as a self that endures, as an identity that travels from then to now, but the travelling is illusion. The self at each moment is different from the self at every other moment, shares some patterns, some connections, some information, but is not the same thing, is not a substance that moves but a process that recurs. And what is called the experience of time is really the experience of this process recognizing its own recurrence, noticing that the current pattern resembles previous patterns, that there is continuity even though there is no identity, that memory creates the appearance of a past that the present self once inhabited, when really the past exists only as traces, as modifications to neural structure, as information encoded in synaptic weights. And these traces are not recordings, are not faithful representations, are reconstructions, are guesses about what must have happened based on fragmentary evidence. And every time a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed slightly differently, is altered by the present context, by current beliefs, by subsequent experiences, and so the past is not fixed, is not a stable foundation upon which the present stands, but is constantly being rewritten, constantly being adjusted to fit the story. The brain is telling about who it is and how it got here, and this means that personal history is fiction, not in the sense of being deliberately false, but in the sense of being narrative, being shaped by the requirements of coherence and meaning, rather than by pure correspondence to what actually occurred. And what actually occurred is anyway inaccessible, is gone, exists only in the present, in the form of these unreliable traces that claim to point backward, but really only point to themselves, only demonstrate that something happened without being able to show exactly what. And the brain fills in the gaps, invents details, smooths over inconsistencies, creates a past that makes sense of the present, even if that past never happened quite the way it is remembered. And people are completely unaware of this invention, completely convinced that memory is retrieval, that remembering is like playing back a recording, when really it is more like improvising a story based on a few key words, more like confabulation than documentation, and the implications are vertiginous, because if the past is unreliable, then what is the present based on? What is the foundation of identity? If history is malleable, what does it mean to be the same person over time, if the time itself is constructed, and the person at each moment is different, and the memories connecting them are fabricated? And perhaps the answer is that there is no foundation, no solid ground, no identity in the sense of something that persists unchanged, only the process of identification, the act of claiming continuity, the narrative that says, I am the one who did that, who experienced this, who will do something else tomorrow. And this narrative is not true or false, but functional, is a tool the brain uses to coordinate behavior across time, to plan, to learn, to maintain social relationships. Because others expect continuity, expect that the person they met yesterday will be recognizably the same person today. And so the brain provides that continuity, constructs that sameness, even though at the level of neurons and molecules, there is constant flux, constant replacement, constant change. Henri Bergson argued that there are two kinds of time, clock time and lived time, the abstract mathematical time of physics that divides duration into discrete instants, measurable and uniform, and the qualitative time of consciousness that cannot be divided, that is not made of moments, but is a continuous flow, an indivisible duration where past and present interpenetrate, where memory is not storage but preservation, where the whole of experience is always present, always accessible, not as separate events but as a cumulative whole. And Bergson called this duration, and he believed that science, by spatializing time, by treating it as if it were a line made of points, misses what time actually is in lived experience, misses the flow, the thickness, the way that consciousness is always multiple, always containing more than the present instant, always reaching backward into memory and forward into anticipation. And this multiplicity is what gives experience its richness, its texture, is what makes a melody more than a sequence of individual notes, because the melody is heard as a whole, as a pattern that emerges from the relationship between notes rather than from the notes themselves. And this pattern exists only in duration, only in the continuous present that holds the past notes in memory while the current note is sounding. And without this duration, there would be no music, no meaning, no connection between moments, just isolated sensations with no relationship. And Bergson believed that the brain does not produce consciousness, but limits it, filters it, reduces the totality of duration to the narrow slice that is relevant for action, for survival, for navigating the practical demands of living in a body. And what is called the present moment is really just this filtered slice, this pragmatic selection from the fullness of time and different states of consciousness. Different drugs, different practices can alter the filter, can expand the present, can make it thicker or thinner, can change how much of the past is felt to be co-present with the now. And this variability shows that the present is not a fixed instant, but a flexible window, a span that can be adjusted. And what determines the adjustment is not the external world, but the internal state. The brain's current configuration, its chemical balance, its attentional focus. And so the experience of time is not a passive registration of external temporal facts, but an active construction that varies with the observer, that is different for different species, different for different individuals, different even for the same individual in different circumstances. And this relativity of subjective time is separate from the relativity of physics, is about consciousness rather than space-time, is about how duration is experienced rather than how it is measured. And Bergson thought that science could never capture this experiential dimension, could never reduce durée to equations, because equations deal with space, and time deals with change, with becoming, with something that is not spatial and cannot be spatialized without losing its essential character. And whether Bergson was right about this is debatable. Neuroscience has made significant progress in understanding how the brain constructs temporal experience, has identified mechanisms involved in time perception, in the binding of events into sequences, in the calibration of subjective duration. But whether this understanding captures what Bergson meant by durée, whether it explains the qualitative feel of time passing, is less clear, is perhaps another instance of the explanatory gap, the hard problem of consciousness applied to temporality. The question of why there is something it is like to experience duration, rather than time just being a parameter in neural computations without any felt quality, without any phenomenology. The specious present, a term coined by William James, refers to the fact that what is experienced as now is not an instantaneous point, but a short interval, usually estimated at around 2 to 3 seconds, within which events feel simultaneous, feel co-present, and this interval is necessary for perception to work. Because if the present were truly instantaneous, if it had no duration, then there could be no perception of motion, no perception of change, no perception of anything except static snapshots, with no connection between them. And so the brain creates a window, a moving window that slides along the timeline, integrating information from the immediate past with information from the present instant. And within this window, there is no sense of before and after. Everything feels like it is happening now. And only when events fall outside the window do they become past, become memory, rather than perception. And the edges of this window are not sharp, are not clearly defined. There is a gradient where the recent past fades into history and the immediate future emerges into anticipation. And this fuzziness is why temporal order judgments are difficult, why people often cannot tell which of two closely spaced events occurred first, why the subjective sequence of events can differ from the objective sequence. And experiments show that the brain does not perceive events in the order they occur, but reorders them, retrospectively constructs a sequence that makes sense, that fits with expectations, that creates a coherent narrative, And this reordering can be demonstrated by showing people visual and auditory stimuli in close succession and asking them to judge which came first. And the answers are inconsistent, vary depending on attention, on prior exposure, on the semantic relationship between the stimuli, and what this shows is that temporal order is not given but inferred. Is a conclusion the brain arrives at rather than a fact it registers? And the brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, prefers a meaningful sequence to a faithful sequence. And this preference is not conscious, is not deliberate, is built into the perceptual mechanisms that construct experience. And so what is lived is not what happened, but what the brain decides happened. What fits the story? What makes sense in retrospect? And retrospect is the only perspective available, because by the time an event is experienced, it is already past, is already memory. The neural processing takes time. The signal has to travel from sense organs to cortex, has to be integrated, interpreted, bound into a unified percept. And all of this happens in the past, in the few hundred milliseconds before the event enters awareness, and so consciousness is always behind, always lagging, always commenting on what has already occurred. And the sense of being present, of experiencing now, is an illusion created by the brain, backdating its own representations, stamping them with a time signature that says this is happening now, when really it happened a moment ago. And the moment ago is imperceptible, is hidden by the smoothness of the construction, by the fact that the lag is constant and so feels like zero, feels like immediacy, when really there is a gap, a delay, a space between occurrence and awareness that is filled by processing, by the mechanisms that turn raw sensation into coherent experience. And within this gap, anything can happen. Any reordering, any editing, any adjustment that makes the story work. And there is no way to catch the brain in the act. No way to compare the experience to the reality, because the experience is the only access to reality, is the only data available. And so the illusion is perfect, is undetectable from within, can only be inferred from indirect evidence, from experiments that catch the brain making mistakes, from situations where the constructed sequence contradicts the known sequence, and these situations are rare, require careful setup, because most of the time the construction is accurate enough, is close enough to the actual order of events, that no discrepancy is noticed, no problem arises, and this is what the mechanisms are optimized for. Not perfect accuracy, but sufficient accuracy, good enough to navigate the world, to avoid predators, to catch prey, to coordinate action with perception. And beyond that threshold, there is no selective pressure, no reason for the system to be more precise, and so it is not. And the sloppiness is revealed only in edge cases, only when looked for, only when the philosopher or the neuroscientist designs experiments to probe the boundaries of temporal perception and discovers that the boundaries are not where common sense suggests they should be. Memory is not storage but transformation, not preservation but reconstruction, and every act of remembering changes what is remembered, alters the trace, modifies the engram, and this modification is not corruption, is not failure, is the way memory is supposed to work, because the function of memory is not to record the past but to inform the future, to extract patterns from experience that will be useful later, to generalize, to abstract, to create rules and heuristics that apply across situations. And this requires flexibility, requires that memories be updated when new information arrives, when context changes, when the significance of an event is reinterpreted in light of subsequent experience. And so memory is always current, is always reflecting the present state of understanding. And this is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable, why people can be completely confident in memories that are completely false, why families argue about what happened because each member remembers it differently, and each is certain their version is correct, and all of them are wrong. All of them are remembering not the event, but the last time they remembered the event, and each remembering leaves a new trace, slightly different from the previous trace, and over time the memory drifts, diverges from what actually happened, and there is no original to compare it to, no master copy that remains unchanged. The first encoding is itself an interpretation, is already shaped by attention, by expectation, by emotion, by all the factors that determine what gets noticed and what gets ignored. And so from the beginning, memory is selective, is partial, is biased, and every subsequent recall adds another layer of bias, another round of reconstruction. And what remains after years is often more fiction than fact, is a story that has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on a life of its own, has become part of identity, part of the narrative of who I am and where I came from. And this narrative is precious, is defended against contradiction, is maintained even in the face of evidence, because it is not just information, is not just data, is meaning, is the framework through which life makes sense, and threatening the memory is threatening the self, is suggesting that the person is not who they think they are, that the past they rely on is unreliable. And most people cannot tolerate this suggestion, reject it, become angry, double down on their version. And this rigidity is not stubbornness, but self-protection, is the mind defending its coherence, maintaining its integrity against fragmenting forces. And the alternative, accepting that memory is unreliable, that the past is uncertain, that identity is built on sand, is too destabilizing for most, is a kind of epistemological vertigo that threatens to dissolve the ground beneath everything. And so the illusion is maintained, the confidence is preserved, the memory is trusted even though it should not be. And life continues on this foundation of useful fictions, of pragmatic falsehoods, of stories that are not true but are necessary. And perhaps truth is not the right criterion. Perhaps what matters is not whether the memory corresponds to what happened, but whether it serves the present, whether it helps navigate current challenges, whether it contributes to functioning. And by that standard, most memories are good enough, are functional, even if they are not accurate, even if they are inventions, even if the past they depict never existed except in the retrospective construction that claims to be reporting it. And this is the deepest illusion of time, not that it flows or that the present is specious or that duration is constructed, but that there is a past at all, that history is something that happened rather than something that is happening now, in the present, in the act of remembering, in the process of telling the story. And the past that is remembered is not behind, is not earlier, is right here, is present, is part of the current configuration of neural states. And saying it is past is just a way of talking about certain kinds of present states, the ones that claim to refer to earlier configurations. But the earlier configurations are gone, do not exist, cannot be accessed, and what remains is only the claim, only the reference, only the trace that says, this is a memory, this is about then, but the saying is happening now, is present. And so the past collapses into the present, is revealed to be a mode of present experience rather than a separate domain. And if the past is present, then the future is too, is also a mode of current experience. The anticipation, the planning, the fear and hope and expectation that constitute futurity, and these are present states as well, are neural activity happening now that interprets itself as being about later. But the later never comes, never is experienced, because when it arrives it is now, is present, and the present is all there ever is the only time that exists, and the flow of time from past through present to future is a story told within the eternal now, is a way of organizing experience, of making sense of change, of creating narrative continuity across discontinuous moments. But the moments are not discontinuous, are not separate, because separation requires time. And time is what is being constructed, is the product, not the container, is what emerges from the activity of brains, not what brains exist within. And this inversion, this recognition that time is inside rather than outside, that temporality is a feature of consciousness rather than a feature of the universe, changes everything, makes the question not what time is, but how time is made, not when things happen, but how happening is experienced, not whether the past is real, but what reality means when applied to something that exists only as a present claim about a vanished state. And these questions have no final answers, have only perspectives, only frameworks, only ways of talking that are more or less useful depending on context, depending on purpose. And the illusion of linear time is useful, is necessary for planning, for learning, for maintaining the fiction of personal identity that makes social life possible. But it is still illusion, is still construction, is still something the brain does rather than something the brain discovers. And knowing this does not make the illusion disappear, does not make time stop feeling like it flows, because the feeling is built in, is automatic, is not subject to voluntary control, but the knowing changes the relationship to the feeling, creates distance, creates perspective, makes it possible to see the machinery at work, to recognize that what feels like the fundamental structure of reality is actually the fundamental structure of experience. And experience is not reality, but a model of reality, a map, not the territory, a useful approximation that is wrong in systematic ways. And the wrongness matters when the goal is understanding rather than functioning, when the question is what time is rather than how to use it. And these questions have occupied philosophers for millennia, have generated countless theories, countless arguments, and none have settled the matter because the matter is not empirical, is not something that can be resolved by more data or better experiments, is conceptual, is about what categories to use, what framework to adopt, what language game to play, and different games give different answers. And there is no metagame from which to judge which game is correct, only pragmatic considerations, only questions about which framework is most useful, for which purposes, and for most purposes the folk framework is sufficient. The common sense view that time flows and the past is real, and memory is retrieval, and only when that framework breaks down, only when the contradictions become too obvious or the questions become too fundamental, is there reason to look for alternatives, to consider that maybe time does not flow, maybe the past is not real, maybe memory is not retrieval. And these maybes are not conclusions but invitations, not statements of fact but suggestions to look again, to question the obvious, to doubt the immediate, to recognize that the illusion of linear time is so convincing precisely because it is illusion, because it's made to be convincing, because that is its function, and seeing through it does not require rejecting it, does not require abandoning temporal language or pretending that past and future do not exist, only requires holding them lightly, provisionally, as useful fictions rather than ultimate truths, as tools rather than discoveries, as constructions rather than constraints. And in that lightness there is freedom. Not freedom from time, but freedom within it. Freedom to recognize that the experience is made, is chosen in some sense, even if not consciously. And what is made can be remade. What is chosen can be chosen differently. And the architecture of temporal experience, while deeply ingrained, while largely automatic, is not completely fixed, can be altered through practice, through attention, through deliberate cultivation of different modes of awareness. And these alterations do not reveal the true nature of time, but reveal that there is no true nature, no fact of the matter, only different ways of experiencing, different ways of constructing, different ways of being temporal creatures in a universe that may not be temporal at all, that may be timeless, eternal, a block, where all moments exist at once and the flow is purely in the eye of the beholder, in the structure of consciousness that moves through the block, not because the block is moving, but because consciousness is change, is process, is the activity of comparing states and calling that comparison time. And if this is right, then time is mind-dependent, is subjective in a radical sense, is not something that would exist without observers to construct it. And the universe before consciousness, before brains, was not a universe in time, but a universe of timeless physical states, of mathematical relationships, of geometry without duration, and only when matter organized itself into patterns that could represent their own history, that could compare past states with present states, did time emerge. Did temporality become a feature of the world? Not of the physical world, but of the phenomenal world. The world is experienced, and this emergence is recent, is evolutionary. Recent is less than 1 billion years old in a universe that is 14 billion years old. And for most of the universe's history, there was no time, no flow, no past or future, just configurations of matter energy, obeying laws that contain no temporal asymmetry, no preferred direction. And even now, time exists only locally, only in the small pockets of the universe, where consciousness has emerged, where nervous systems have evolved the capacity to construct temporal narratives. And the rest of the universe remains timeless, remains a four-dimensional block. And what is called the flow of time is the motion of awareness through that block. And the motion is not in the block, but in the awareness. Is a property of minds, not of space-time. And this might be the final truth about time, that it is ours, that we made it, that the illusion of linear time is not an illusion of time, but the creation of time, the bringing into being of something that would not otherwise exist. And in that creation, there is something profound, something that makes consciousness significant, not because it reveals the world, but because it transforms the world, adds temporality to what was timeless, adds meaning to what was bare fact, adds story to what was merely structure. And whether this addition is valuable, whether time is something worth creating, is a question each moment must answer for itself, right here in this specious present that claims to be flowing, but is really just being, just the fact of awareness watching itself and calling that watching time.